Now, in recent years, philosophers and others have raised questions about the moral justifiability of the ways we human beings treat the other animals, about whether we should eat meat, use animal products, experiment on animals, and so on. What justifies us in engaging in practices that are harmful to the animals themselves? One response you often meet with is the claim that human beings are just more important or more valuable than the other animals are. After all, given the choice between saving a human being and saving another animal in some sort of emergency, we would ordinarily save the human being. Doesn't that show that we think human beings matter more? Because of our intelligence, our linguistic abilities, our cultural capacities, or our moral nature, many people claim human beings or human lives are more valuable than the lives of the other animals, and what happens to us therefore matters more. Some people also extend this kind of thinking to other species, endorsing an order of importance among them. Many people share the intuition that there's something worse about the brutal treatment of animals who are in certain ways more like us, intelligent animals like primates and cetaceans, or animals who appear to have sophisticated emotional capacities, for example. And one explanation of that intuition would be that because of the capacities they share with us, primates and cetaceans are more valuable and important than the so-called lower animals are. Now, I think that the trouble with this view is not exactly that it's false, that is, that the other animals are just as important as people, but rather that it makes almost no sense whatever. So in this paper, I'm going to do 4 things. First, I'm going to explain why I think that the view that human beings are more important or valuable than the other animals makes almost no sense. Then I'm going to back that up with that explanation up with a theory about why anything is important or valuable at all. That is, I'm going to sketch a theory of the good, an explanation of why there is such a thing as the good. We're then going to look at some objections to that theory, which will lead us to consider the relationship between having a self and having a good. And thinking about that relation is going to put us in a position to see why it can seem to us as if some animals were more important and valuable than others, even if they're not. What's at stake, besides the practical issues about the way we should treat the other animals, is an important point about the metaphysical structure of value itself. Now, the point about the metaphysical structure of value is controversial, but it's easily stated. I believe that nothing can be important without being important to someone or something, usually to some creature, that is, some person or animal. Creature is the word I use when I'm referring to both people and animals. Relatedly, I believe that nothing can be good or bad without being good or bad for some creature. Now, if that's right, we need to be more specific about what exactly the claim of superior human importance is supposed to be. To whom are human beings supposed to be more important? To the universe, to God, to ourselves? Obviously, as individuals, we may be more important to ourselves than other people are, and our friends and families may be more important to us than strangers. There's philosophical disagreement about how exactly we're to understand this kind of partiality, what justifies it, if anything, and what in turn it justifies. But I think that most philosophers agree that the fact that someone is more important to me justifies only a limited form of partiality in certain well-defined circumstances, and does not commit me to the view that the person who's more important to me is actually objectively more valuable than anybody else. But the general point is that if everything that matters must matter to someone, to some creature, then there's no place where we can stand from which we can coherently ask which creatures or which kinds of creatures matter more absolutely. Or rather, there's almost no place, as I'm about to explain. There are 2 different inferences you might draw from the point I just made, and I want to distinguish between them. And when we do distinguish between them, you'll see that there's a little problem with what I've been saying. You might think that what I've said implies the view that all value is, in a certain popular sense of the term, relative. Then you will think what I'm saying is there are things that are important to me and things that are important to you, but there's nothing that's quite simply and absolutely important or valuable. But actually, that doesn't have to follow. So what I have in mind is a somewhat different view, which I will call the view that all importance and value are tethered. In particular, they are tethered to the creature to whom the thing in question is important, or for whom it's good, and cannot be cut loose from that creature without ceasing to be important or valuable at all. Although someone who holds the view that all value is tethered denies that there's such a thing as free-floating value, goodness that isn't good for anyone, she's not committed to the view that nothing is valuable absolutely. Because there might still be ends that everyone, that is everyone who can think about these things, must agree are worth bringing about. It's just that they will be worth bringing about in virtue of the fact that they're good for someone. This, after all, is what we want from a notion of absolute value, the notion of something that's good from every point of view, something whose value must be acknowledged by everyone who can think about value. There's no difference between being absolute and being relative to everyone. Now, of course, there's still a complication that arises from the view that all value is tethered. We can't move from the claim that something's good for you to the claim that it's good absolutely by invoking the premise that it's good absolutely in an untethered way, that people and animals should get what's good for them. Instead, we would have to arrive at the conclusion that what's good for you is good absolutely by showing that it is in a certain way good for everyone, or good from everyone's point of view. It's good that perhaps you and people and animals generally should get what's good for them. Now, explaining exactly how that could be is a tall order, and I'm not going to be doing that in this paper. But, and this is the problem I mentioned, it does leave a logical opening for the view that human welfare is more important absolutely than that of the other animals. It's just that what we would have to show is that even from the point of view of the other animals themselves, the good of human being matters more than the good of those other animals themselves. We would have to show that our good is what is best for them or from their point of view. It's hard to imagine anything that could make that even remotely plausible, except some sort of teleological view, according to which human good is the purpose of the world towards which all things in some way strive. And of course, that's no accident. The view that human beings are more important than the other animals wears a religious heritage on its sleeve. Now, of course, those who hold that human beings are more important absolutely can deny the implausible view that human beings are more important than the other animals, even from the point of view of the other animals themselves. They can do this by denying that value is tethered. Then they can suppose that human beings can matter more than the other animals without mattering more to anyone in particular. The belief in untethered value, I think, puts human beings in a position to imagine that we can make claims about our own superior importance that don't, in fact, make any sense outside of an antiquated teleological conception of the world. Now, in order to explain why I believe these things, I'm going to sketch a theory of the good according to which value is tethered. So now we're going to ask a big philosophical question. Why is there value? Why does anything matter? In arguing that the importance or value of something is always tethered to some creature, I've already given you a clue as to what I think the answer is. I think there are things that matter because there are entities to whom things matter, entities for whom things can be good or bad, in the sense that might matter morally. What are these entities? The answer I'm about to argue is basically animals, creatures, including ourselves. This remark, as we'll see, is almost true by definition, for there's a tight connection between the concept of an animal at least on one philosophical conception of what an animal is, and the concept of a being for whom things can be good or bad. A being who, as I like to put it, has a good. Okay, now I said a moment ago that animals almost by definition have a good in the sense that might matter morally. This qualification is necessary because we use the word good in two different ways, each associated with its own sense of good for. First, good is our most general term of positive evaluation, a term we apply to nearly every kind of thing, or at least every kind of thing for which we have any use or with which we interact. Think of the wide variety of things we evaluate as good or bad. Cars, houses, machines and instruments, dogs and cats, food, weather, days, prose, pictures, movies, people considered as occupying roles, son, president, friend, carpenter, people considered just as people, among many other things. All of those things may be evaluated as good or bad. Now, I'm going to call that the evaluative, or for reasons I'll explain later, the functional sense of good. I call good in the second sense in which we use the term the final sense of good, borrowing one familiar translation of the Greek word telos, meaning a goal or an end. We call something good in the final sense when we consider it worth having, realizing, or bringing about for its own sake. We suppose that something we call the good, or in our own case sometimes the human good, is the end or aim of all our strivings, or at any rate the crown of their success. The summum bonum, a state of affairs that is desirable or valuable or worth achieving for its own sake. Final goods are the ends of action and the conditions that result from the successful pursuit of those ends. Now ask yourself, why do we use the same word, good, both as our most general term of positive evaluation and to designate the ends of action and the condition that results from their successful pursuit? What do these two uses have in common? I think most people think that the answer to this question is obvious. They think that in both cases we're using the term evaluatively. That is, they think that when we use the term good to refer to a final good, that's just a special case of the evaluative good, one in which what we're evaluating is a person's ends or how his life is going. And that seems reasonable enough, but there's a puzzle about how exactly we're supposed to evaluate lives and ends. As Plato and Aristotle pointed out long ago, evaluation is usually related to the purpose, role, or function of the entity that's judged good or bad. An entity is good in the evaluative sense when it has the properties that enable it to serve its function, either its usual or natural function, or one we've assigned to it for some specific purpose. A good knife is sharp because the function of knives is cutting. A good teacher is clear because the function of a teacher is to help her students understand the material. A good car handles easily, gets good gas mileage, and goes fast because the function of a car is to get people quickly and safely to destinations they can't easily reach on foot. These things are evaluated as good because they have the properties that enable them to serve their function, to do their functions well. But what is the function of an end or a life? Ends and lives don't seem to have functions. In fact, to say something is an end and not a means is precisely to say that we do not value it merely because of some other purpose that it serves. But then how are we evaluating it when we say that it's good? To what evaluative standard could we be appealing? Now, one thing that seems clear is that when we say that a life is good, in the sense that we want now, the sense that allows us to say that it's good for the creature or important to the creature whose life it is, we're looking for a standard that makes it good from the point of view of that creature. A life could be good from some other point of view, like that of the farmer who values the life of his cow, but that doesn't give us the sense that supports the idea that the life is good for the cow. This point turns out to be the key to solving our problem, although it'll take me a little while to explain why. First, notice that the evaluative or functional sense of good also supports the notion of good for in a particular way. If a thing is good when it has the properties that enable it to perform its function, well, then the conditions and actions that tend to give rise to those properties or enable it to maintain those properties count as good for it. In this sense, which I'm going to call the functional sense of good for, it might be good for your knife to be sharpened regularly, and bad for your knife to be used on materials that tend to dull its blade. A whetstone is good for your knife, too. A certain kind of gas might be good for your car, and it might be bad for your car to leave it sitting idle too long. When we use the concept of good for in this way, we refer to activities or conditions that maintain or promote the ability of the knife or the car to function well. But of course, we don't mean they're good from the point of view of the knife or the car, because knives and cars don't have points of view. Okay, but now think about what an animal is. Aristotle taught us that it's possible to regard living organisms as having a function, which he identified as that of self-maintenance, or more strictly, maintaining their own forms. Aristotle argued that everything, every substance, whatever, everything that's a thing, can be seen as having a form and a matter. The matter is the material or the parts of which it's composed, and the form is the way the parts are put together, which is what makes it the kind of thing that it is. In particular, the form is what enables it to serve its function. So, for instance, we might say that the matter of a house is roof, walls, windows, and doors. And then we impose some form on these parts by establishing certain relations between them. We line the walls up corner to corner, put the roof over the top, insert the door into one of the walls so we can go in and out, and behold, we have an object that can function as a shelter, something in which people can keep themselves and their things safe from other people and animals and the weather. Now, Aristotle was also impressed by the fact that living organisms are made of fragile materials that are constantly being used up as energy or worn out or damaged in other ways. But organisms constantly take in new materials from the environment through the nutritive process and turn those materials into fresh parts of themselves, thus keeping themselves, for a while at least, in existence. Furthermore, living organisms also make new kinds of things like themselves, things with the same form as themselves, through reproduction. So Aristotle observed that we can explain a great deal about living organisms if we view them as objects that have the function of maintaining their own forms in those two senses. They maintain themselves in existence as individual members of their kind, and they maintain their species by producing new members of their kind. Now, when we view an organism as a functional object in this way, then it's like any other functional object. We can see the things and conditions that enable it to perform its function, to stay alive and reproduce, as things that are good for it in the functional sense of good for. Just as whetstone is good for the knife and being driven now and then is good for the car, rain and sunshine are good for the plants, and fresh air and exercise are good for both you and your dog. There are, however, two important differences between animals and functional artifacts like knives and cars. The first difference applies to living organisms generally, including now both animals and plants. Although we're getting better at producing machines that are in various ways self-maintaining, generally speaking, a knife does not sharpen itself, and a car does not seek out the best quality of gasoline. But a living organism does do things like this. So there's something special about the way that living organisms function, which is by tending to their own well-functioning. by looking after it. In fact, unlike a car or a knife, that is an organism's function. After all, that's really all that organisms do. They take care of themselves and their offspring, and so keep themselves and their kind in existence. There's a kind of self-referential character to an organism's functioning, for its function is more or less to preserve a certain way of functioning, the way characteristic of its kind, and nothing more. Or at least we can view organisms this way, a point I'll come back to. And when we do see them this way, we see them as beings for whom things can be good or bad in the functional sense of good for and bad for. That's what we're doing when we say the rain and sunshine are good for the plants. We mean that the rain and the sunshine are helping the plants to maintain those properties that enable the plants to perform their function, which is simply to stay alive and reproduce. So the first difference is that living organisms, unlike artifacts, take care of themselves. They are, in fact, simply various ways of taking care of the various ways in which an entity can take care of itself. Now, the second difference brings us to what's distinctive about animals as opposed to plants. An animal, at least as I'll use the term here, is a particular kind of living organism. An animal is an organism that functions, at least in part, by representing the world to herself through her senses, and then acting in light of those representations. She is guided by her representations to get the things that are good for her and avoid the things that are bad for her in the functional senses of good for and bad for. In order for an animal's representational system to work in this way, however, the animal's representational system has to have what I will call a valenced character. That means that the things she encounters in the world have to strike her as attractive or aversive, welcome or unwelcome, pleasant or painful in particular ways, depending on whether and how they're good or bad for her. She has to be drawn by the way the world appears to her to seek out the things that are good for her and to avoid the things that are bad. So she has to perceive the world evaluatively as a place full of things which present themselves as attractive and to be sought, and things which present themselves as aversive and to be avoided. In other words, an animal experiences her own condition and the things that affect it as good or bad for her. But now they're not merely good or bad in the functional sense, but in the final sense too. Since for an animal, getting the things that are good for her and avoiding the things that are bad for her have become the ends of action. That's how an animal works, how she functions, how she goes about taking care of herself. She is designed to monitor her own condition, that is her own ability to function, by representing the world in ways that will motivate her to keep her condition good. A well-functioning animal likes to eat when she's hungry, is eager to mate, feeds and cares for her offspring, works assiduously to keep herself clean and healthy, fears her enemies, and avoids the sources of injury. And don't say, well, of course she does. Allow yourself to be struck by the fact that there are entities, substances, things who stand in this relation to their condition. Because what I'm saying is an animal functions in part by making her own well-functioning, the things that are good for her in the functional sense, the ends of action, the things to go for, final goods. The final good came into the world with animals then, for an animal is pretty much by definition the kind of thing that has a final good, a good in the sense that might matter morally. These final goods are tethered to the animals for whom they're good. Okay, so now let me come back quickly to a question I raised earlier. By what standard are we evaluating a creature's life or her ends when we say that they're good in the final sense of good? When we say that something is a final good, what we are saying is that it constitutes or contributes to the well-functioning of an entity who experiences her own functional condition in a valenced way and pursues her own functional goods through action. The standard is one that must be deployed from the standpoint of empathy, because when we invoke it, we are looking at the creature's functional goods as if through her own eyes, in the way that she necessarily looks at them herself, as things worth pursuing or realizing for their own sakes. Final goods exist because there are such creatures, creatures for whom things can be good or bad. Now, obviously, much more needs to be said in defense of this account of the good, and I do some of that elsewhere. What I'm going to do in this paper is develop it a little further in response to an objection that has probably occurred to many of you while I was laying out the view. I have followed Aristotle and a long tradition in talking about organisms and their parts as having functions, and in particular about organisms having the function of self-maintenance. People often say that we no longer believe in anything like functions or natural purposes. Instead, we believe that organisms evolved through natural selection. At the beginning of this paper, I castigated my imaginary opponents for secretly adhering to the implications of an antiquated teleological conception of the world. But you will object, this is exactly what I'm doing myself. Now, I might respond that the theory of evolution does not show us that there are no functionally self-maintaining objects. Instead, it shows us how there can be such objects even if no one invented them. We might also then be tempted to say it explains something else about organisms. If we regard living organisms as self-maintaining systems, then we must regard them as extremely defective ones, because all individuals eventually die. If individuals are essentially self-maintaining, why should that be? What is biologically necessary for the species, we know, or the genes, if you like that way of talking, is only that there are individuals who live long enough to reproduce, and so maintain themselves long enough to reproduce. So animals are defective self-maintaining systems in part because natural selection only selects for self-maintenance up to the time of reproduction. But this response, of course, only brings out a deeper problem. Why should we call these organisms self-maintaining at all? Why isn't only, or at most, the species that may be regarded as self-maintaining? I say at most because, of course, it's also true that all species go extinct. Now, in fact, for individuals, there's a further problem, which is even trickier to deal with. Consider this. Even if an organism were a successfully self-maintaining organism, it could still die of an accident. It could get eaten, or burnt up in a fire, or squashed by a meteorite, or trapped in a deep pit where its needs could not be met. These are just the hazards of material existence. There are a few species of organism. The examples are all controversial, but hydras, flatworms, and a certain species of jellyfish have been suggested, that apparently do always die of accidents, and so are potentially, although never actually, immortal. But most animals are due to die of senescence, the natural weakening of the body with age, even if they don't die of accidents or diseases. Perhaps this is better for the species, since an ever-fresh supply of slightly different individuals enables it to adapt better to changing conditions, precisely so that its members do not all die of accidents. But if that's true, how can the individuals of the species be characterized as self-maintaining? In these animals, animals subject to senescence, death is not just a hazard of material existence. It is, in Aristotelian terms, built into their forms. Now, this raises some rather large issues about the use of the notion of function in biology, because if nothing is really biologically self-maintaining, then it's not clear what entitles us to use the concept of function when we talk about living things. But if we can't talk about function when we talk about organisms, we can't talk about their functional good either. If they have no function, they have no functional good, and then nothing is functionally good for them. In that case, it looks as if we're saying something wholly without foundation when we say that sunshine and rain are good for the plants, in the functional sense of good for. Or at most, if we grant that the species is self-maintaining, it's a shorthand way of saying they're good for the species. But if we can't talk about an individual's functional good, then of course I can't say that final good and the final sense of good for appeared in the world when animals evolved and began to take their functional goods as the ends of action and to see them as things to go for. Now, I think we still can say these things. I think what all of this shows is that when we talk about functional good, we are saying something contextual, and that what forms the context is a point of view. Here's a simple example. When I say that the function of a knife is cutting, and that a good knife has a sharp blade, and that things that keep the knife sharp, like a whetstone, are good for the knife, I am not saying anything that has to be rejected in the name of scientific naturalism. I am simply speaking from the point of view of a human being who sometimes has to do some cutting. And when I say that water is good for me because I need it to live, I say it from the point of view of a human being who wants to go on living. And when I feel that water is good for me because I was dry and thirsty, and the relief from that is welcome to me, I feel it from the point of view of a creature who experiences her own condition in a valenced way and is genetically predisposed to seek out and enjoy such things as water in order to keep herself in existence. I may also be genetically predisposed to senescence, but I am not predisposed to seek it out as an end of action or to enjoy it when it comes. Except under special circumstances, therefore, I don't regard senescence and death as part of my final good. It follows from that, or so I'm about to claim, that it's not part of my functional good. Now, of course, you're going to object that I cannot possibly legitimately say that. After all, I've claimed that final good came into the world when we animals who pursue our functional goods as the end of action came into the world. Now I'm claiming that whether something is properly part of your functional good depends on whether it contributes in the right way to your final good. So I seem to have reversed the order of dependence between these two kinds of goodness. I can't claim that final good is functional good actively pursued and then turn around and limit functional good to what contributes to final good, because I would need an independent notion of final good in order to do that. Furthermore, I don't want to identify final good simply with what actually appears good from our point of view, because I do want to say that we and all other animals can be wrong about this. It happens all the time. Animals evolve in one set of conditions, and when those conditions change, animals may want things that aren't good for them, or fail to want things that are. Notoriously, this is the standard example of this sort of thing, human beings evolve to want to stock up on salt and fatty foods when the supplies are good, in anticipation of the lean times when they won't be. When those lean times never come, those desires do not serve our functional good, and I want to say their satisfaction does not serve our final good either. We are wrong not to crave a leaner, blander diet, although we have a hard time seeing it as good. If we reject the idea that the leaner, blander diet is genuinely good for us as individuals, then the only available explanation for the claim is that it serves the interest of the species. But if that's the basis of the claim, then why aren't we also wrong not to crave death, which probably also serves the interest of the species? Well, the reason is that when animals evolved to pursue their functional goods through action, something else evolved, namely consciousness, subjectivity, which then became essential to the individual identity of the creatures who have it. When I say that something is good for me, even in the functional sense, the me that I'm referring to is the embodiment of myself, a conscious subject and agent who is more or less, for this is a matter of degree, functionally unified over time. Speaking a little roughly, Your self is functionally unified insofar as you have an integrated point of view at a time and over time that enables you to carry out your projects and stick to your commitments in a world in which you are able to find your way around. For a human being, this has two distinct aspects. The unity of what we might call your acting self, a unity that we usually call integrity, enables you to pursue your ends effectively and maintain your projects, commitments, relationships, and values over time. The unity of what we call your knowing self involves the formation of an integrated conception of your environment, one that enables you to identify relations between the different parts of your environment well enough to find your way around in it. Those relations are temporal, spatial, causal, and for us and many other animals, social. By forming a unified conception of your environment, you also unify yourself as the subject of that conception. The fact that I identify with myself, that is, with the agent of my projects and commitments and the subject of my conception of the world, means that there may be things about my body, such as its tendency to senescence, that aren't good for me, even if they are perhaps good for my species or my genes. They aren't good, that is, for the things that I experience and identify as me. So my functional good is what maintains the aspects of me that support my having a self. So I haven't exactly reversed the order between final and functional good. Instead, what I've done is point out something that happens to the identity of an object when that object acquires consciousness and a point of view. The object acquires a new form of identity, a self. And since it is the self that experiences its condition and the things in the world as good or bad, and the self that decides what to do and acts, it's the self that has a final good. Now, some people think that you have to be self-conscious in order to have a self. The self isn't like most other things, which exist independently of your awareness of them. Your self only exists, the claim is, if you have some awareness that it's there. And that, of course, would have to be a kind of self-awareness. Initially, it may seem paradoxical that you could be aware of something that would not exist at all unless you were aware of it. But if you think about it, you'll see why it's plausible that the self should have this reflexive character. After all, as I've already suggested, you acquire a self when you acquire a point of view, a form of awareness. Having a point of view introduces a distinction between yourself and the rest of the world. It identifies you and makes you identify yourself with a specific spot in the world from which the rest of the world appears to you. It identifies some of the things that happen in the world as things that happen to you. And it does this not just externally, but from your own point of view. So to have a self is to have a point of view, and to have a point of view is to be aware of the difference between you and everything else. And in that sense, to be aware of yourself. What I've just been saying about the connection between having a self and having a final good seems to require that thought, since I claimed that having a self determines what you identify as yourself, causing you to identify with the features of your embodiment that support the existence of a unified point of view, and to regard only those features as part of your functional good. But if the self is dependent on self-consciousness in this way, can the other animals have selves? It's sometimes said that human beings are the only animals who are self-conscious. Immanuel Kant once wrote, "The fact that man can have the idea I raises him infinitely above all the other beings living on the earth. By this he is a person, and by virtue of the unity of his consciousness, through all the changes he may undergo, he is one and the same person. That is, a being altogether different in rank and dignity from things, such as irrational animals, which we can dispose of as we please." Kant thinks that only we human beings think about ourselves. Now, we don't know much about the thoughts of animals or what goes on when they're thinking. The serious study of animal minds is an extremely young science, less than a century old. Presumably, it's different for different animals, depending on what sort of cognitive powers they have. It may be true that only we human beings think about ourselves, if that means having thoughts in which we identify ourselves as I. But even if it were, the issue is more complicated than that, because self-consciousness is something that comes in degrees and takes many different forms. One form of self-consciousness is revealed by the famous mirror test used in animal studies. In the mirror test, a scientist paints, say, a red spot on an animal's body, forehead, someplace the animal can't naturally see, and then puts her in front of a mirror. If the animal eventually reaches for the spot and tries to rub it off or looks away from the mirror towards that location on her body, we can take that as evidence that the animal recognizes herself in the mirror and is curious about what has happened to her body. Apes, dolphins, elephants, and a few birds have passed the mirror test. An animal that passes the mirror test seems to know that a certain body is her own or herself. She recognizes the animal in the mirror as me, and therefore some people think must have a concept of me. But failure to pass the mirror test does not imply that an animal is not self-conscious. In many cases, I think all it shows is the animal doesn't understand the protocol of mirrors. I think it can be argued that even animals who don't pass the mirror test have forms of self-consciousness. In fact, I think it can be argued that pleasure and pain are forms of self-consciousness, since what the animal who experiences these things is experiencing is the effects of the world on himself, on his own condition. In that sense, all animals are self-conscious because they can feel their existence. Again, you have self-consciousness if you have some sort of awareness that one of the things in your world is you, and this awareness can be relational. In fact, at some level, it has to be relational, since what it is to be self-conscious is to stand in a certain relation to the rest of the world and have a point of view on it. You have to distinguish yourself from the rest of the world. This kind of relational knowledge is absolutely essential to action, because in order to act, you have to orient yourself within the world. You have to have some sense of what your own position is in it. A tiger who stands downwind of her intended prey is not merely aware of her prey. She is also locating herself with respect to her prey in physical space, and that suggests a form of self-consciousness. A social animal who makes gestures of submission when a more dominant animal enters the scene is locating himself in social space, and that too suggests a kind of self-consciousness. Knowing how you're related to others in space or in a social order involves something more than merely knowing about them. It involves knowing how you stand with them, and that requires some kind of conception of yourself. Now, of course, there's something right about what Kant says when he emphasizes that having a self involves having a consciousness that's unified over time. But the view that only human beings have that is way too extreme. Instead, I believe that having a self is a matter of degree, a matter of how much functional unity your point of view has at a time and over time. Here's what I have in mind. When philosophers work on questions of what we call personal identity, we identify certain factors as giving a person a certain kind of continuity over time, and so making the person one person, a person with a single self enduring. These are the factors that tend to unify the person's point of view over time. Learning, episodic memory, ongoing relationships, even long-term projects are among these factors. But these factors may also be found to varying degrees in the lives of animals. Many animals can learn, and that means that what happens to them at one moment changes the way they respond to the world at another. Animals also do other things that systematically influence and so unify their points of view over time. They can acquire tastes and make friends, and even take on projects and roles in their communities. If one animal bonds with another, he feels comfortable when he encounters that others, and in some cases uncomfortable when he does not. If he decides to build his nest or his dam or his burrow in some particular spot, then he returns to that spot every day when the day's foraging is done. If he makes a mental map of a certain region to which he's been newly transported, then he can find his way around there with ease. If what happens to you or what you do at one time changes your point of view of the world at another time in a systematic way, then yourself acquires an ongoing character that makes it a more unified self over time. Now, philosophers who think about what gives a human being a unified self over time like to emphasize memory. But what I'm talking about doesn't require episodic memory, the memory of particular events. An animal that's frequently beaten becomes fearful and cringing or hostile and aggressive. An animal that's regularly treated well becomes relaxed and confident. These are not just changes in the animal's outward behavior. They reflect changes in the way the animal experiences the world and the animal's expectations. They are ways in which what the animal experiences now is informed by what he experienced in the past. An animal doesn't need to remember specific occasions in order for this to happen. Experience is something that accumulates, constantly modifying experience itself. The animal's point of view becomes more unified in the sense that the animal responds to the same things in the same ways at different times. But at the same time, it also becomes more flexible as the animal's repertoire of responses that are appropriate to his environment accumulate. He learns to avoid more of the things that will hurt him and seek out more of the things he'll enjoy. Okay, now why does all this matter to our topic? It matters because it changes the way in which things can be good or bad for an animal. People like to say that animals live in the moment. And in one sense, that's probably right. Unlike us human beings, they don't seem to spend a lot of time planning for the future or fretting about problems that may or may not arise. But in another sense, I don't think it's true. Or perhaps what I should say is, at least for many animals, the moment itself doesn't live merely in the moment, but reverberates with the character of the other moments in the animal's life. The more that's true, the more the animal's experiences build on themselves in forming his point of view, the more it becomes true that it makes sense to identify what is good or bad for him in larger temporal units. Any sentient animal has good experiences and bad ones. But the more that experience accumulates, the more it makes sense to think that the animal, like a human being, can have a good or a bad life, where a life is not just a string of good or bad experiences, but a kind of whole with an overall character of its own. And it becomes true that there's something that it's like to live that life. Now, I'm mentioning all this for two related reasons. First, many people do believe that animal experience is quite disconnected, and that this somehow makes not only the death of a non-human animal, but even her pains less bad for her than they would be for a human being. Killing her is supposed to be less bad because she has no plans and projects whose completion will be undercut by death. No ongoing relations that'll be disrupted, no hopes for the future that'll be disappointed. Hurting her is supposed to be less bad because an isolated pain, neither resented nor remembered, ceases to trouble you the moment that it's over. No doubt there are ways in which the nature of your mind and the resulting character of your experience can make pain either worse or less bad. Many people suppose that the fact that human beings have reflective capacities makes a difference of that kind, makes pain worse for us. But the lack of reflection doesn't always make suffering less bad. In some cases, animals who are not reflective may suffer less because they don't reflect on the fact that they're suffering and then in turn suffer from that reflection. But in other cases, animals may suffer more because they do not know that it'll be over in a moment. Animals can't laugh at their pains. We do it all the time. But even if it did follow from the disconnected and transitory nature of a creature's experience that its death and suffering were less bad, it's simply not true that all animals have such transitory experience. It really depends what sort of animal we're talking about and how much of an ongoing self the animal has. But to the extent to which it is true, it points to one explanation of the moral intuition from which I started, which is that the fate of more cognitively sophisticated animals matters more than that of less cognitively sophisticated ones. Cognitively sophisticated here is something of a weasel word, which you often encounter in the literature, since no one seems to be sure exactly which cognitive powers matter and why. It can't plausibly be thought that the difference is merely one of intelligence, because we certainly do not think that the fate of more intelligent people matters more than the fate of less intelligent ones. What I'm suggesting is that the cognitive differences that are relevant to the intuition in question are the ones that also inform the extent to which it makes sense to think of the animal as having a unified and ongoing self, and the kinds of experiences that can characterize a unified and ongoing self. Things that can matter only to animals with more ongoing selves could not matter or matter as much to animals whose experience is more disconnected. Something can only be good for you, can only matter to you to the extent that there is a you, which is to say, to the extent that there's a unified you. And that could be a matter of degree. Now, earlier I argued that people are not more important than animals, that more generally it makes no sense to say that some creatures are more important than others. Am I now taking it back? Not at all. What I'm suggesting is just that what exactly can be important to or good for the animal herself varies with the extent to which she has a self. If an animal does not have much of an ongoing self, then perhaps death cannot matter as much to that animal as it would to someone else. To the extent that what you lose through death is yourself, such an animal has less to lose. A similar point may hold about pleasure and pain, although I admit I'm less sure about this. If some animals really do have disconnected experiences, so that the badness or goodness of one experience really has no ramifications for the badness or goodness of others, then maybe the experiences themselves are less bad for those animals themselves, or less good. That would essentially be the same fact as the fact that such animals have less of a self for whom those experiences can be good or bad. If we can translate tethered values into absolute values in the way I mentioned earlier, this might have practical ramifications. In a case where we had to choose between saving a human being and saving an animal with a less connected identity, we would save the human being. But there's nothing whatever in the arguments that I've just been canvassing that suggests that human beings are more important than the other animals or justifies any general preference for the satisfaction of human interests over those of the other animals. Certainly, there's nothing in these arguments to justify the imposition of what is obviously terrible suffering on animals for the sake of human interests in factory farms or laboratories. These arguments grant only that certain kinds of evils may have a different character for the animals themselves, depending on what and how much of a self they have. The goods and evils I've been talking about all remain tethered to the animals for whom they're good or bad. So now I'll conclude. In this paper, I've argued that value is tethered, that things are only good or bad insofar as they're good or bad for the world's creatures, for the people and animals for whom things can be good or bad. Value came into the world when creatures of this kind evolved. If value is tethered, the claim that some creatures are more important than others cannot be made in any plausible form. It's a holdover from a teleological conception of the world according to which human good is the final purpose of everything. Nevertheless, within a tethered conception of value, sense can be made of the claim that the deaths and perhaps the pains of some kinds of creatures should matter less to us than the deaths and the pains of others. Such deaths and pains should matter less if they should, because and only because they matter less to the creatures themselves, and not because the creatures themselves matter less. What follows exactly, practically, is a matter for detailed argument, but a general preference for the human good over the good of the other animals does not. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have a brief period for questions, and if you'd like to raise a question, then please come to the front. Jane.
Chris, thank you very much for that great talk. Just one question about the intelligibility of the question of whether humans might matter more than other kinds of animals. If we accept your very attractive tethered conception of the good, one way of understanding that question would just be as the question of whether, from the point of view of us, human beings, members of our species, other animals are more important than members of our species. It seems to me that's a perfectly, it may not be a plausible claim, but it's at least an intelligible claim within the vocabulary of tethered value, just as it might be plausible to say that for the hungry lion, mother lion with an offspring, its offspring is more important to it, or seems more important than I do, where I might be something that it could eat and sustain itself for a while. So those claims seem, I'm not saying it's plausible necessarily to say that from the tethered perspective of anthropomorphic life and value, humans matter more than other animals, but it seems to me it's an intelligible kind of claim, and I can imagine someone who's going to defend the comparative value of humans compared to animals. Someone like Williams would perhaps appeal to that anthropomorphic point of view. That is our point of view. You've done a very good job of showing why our evaluative assessments have to be understood in a way that's tethered to that point of view, but then you've given us a framework within which these comparative attributions of value to humans and other kinds of animals at least make sense and might even be plausible.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by plausible here, because, of course, we may be partial to our own species, but I take it that as long as that's a judgment that arises only from our point of view and can't be justified from the point of view of other creatures who also have a good, so can't be made absolute, it's merely a form of partiality. And as I said, partiality justifies only certain forms of behavior in certain limited circumstances. I'm even prepared to say that there could be circumstances in which human partiality for humanity justifies unhappy treatment of animals. Take, for instance, an epidemiological emergency in which you have to kill a lot of birds or something in order to save the human beings from. You could say that kind of thing and still not be driven to say, oh, we're just so much more important in general that it's fine the way we treat them in laboratories and on factory farms. Because it is still just partiality.
So I just wanted to invite you to perhaps say a bit more about what the relationship between importance and final good, what the relationship of that is to what ought to be done. So it seemed in the way that you set up the problem at the beginning there was it seems to be sort of presupposed that if we were more important than other animals, that would imply something about how we should treat other animals. And yet it wasn't entirely clear to me what the link was between saying that something is finally good or saying that it's important and saying that we ought to act in a certain way.
Yeah, I didn't say anything about that in this paper because I haven't quite got to the point where we're talking about moral value yet. And when I said that the idea that human beings were more important might be taken to justify the way that we're actually treating the other animals. I just meant that's what you hear people say. That's what people often say to you when you're giving talks on this subject. They raise their hand and say, aren't human beings just more important? So I was just reflecting sort of a sense of who I was speaking to when I said that. Basically, the one thing, and it's not very clear, that I'm prepared to say at this point about thinking of morality in terms of the good, and I still think there are notions of the right that have to be worked out, but thinking of morality in terms of the good, if you think that the good is a tethered notion, then the idea of what you should be aiming at is relatively, extensive inclusion. A solution is better when it includes the good, sort of more of those involved than the other, not because of aggregation, because you can't aggregate on a tethered conception of the good, but just because more tethered goods get realized that way.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. So I have two questions. I think they're both pretty simple. The first is about, well, I just wanted to invite you to say something more about what it is for representations to be valenced, because I take it can't be, it's not supposed to be merely being driven toward the thing or desiring it in a certain sense, but it also can't be taking the thing to be good, period, or good absolutely, unless first there's something false about these representations. The other thing that I think may be related, but maybe not, is I was quite surprised by your suggestion that pleasure and pain are forms of self-consciousness. It seems like the natural thing to say is that pleasure and pains are forms of being conscious of the world. So to feel pain is to feel yourself cut by something, or to feel the sharpness of the thing. Maybe I'm not making a good case for that, but I'd appreciate elaboration on that too.
I don't know if this is fair when you're giving a two-lecture set, one of which is a named lecture and the other one's a colloquium. But if you want to hear more about valence, come back tomorrow, and you will hear more than you ever wanted to know about the subject. Can I just answer it that way? Is that okay? I mean, because there's a lot, and I really don't want to try to cough it up here. It seems to me that you answered your own question about pleasure and pain when you said you feel yourself being cut. I mean, feeling pleasure and pain is not just like, say, seeing something. It doesn't just give you information about what's going on out there. What it is being aware of the way in which the world is having an impact on you. And what you're feeling is essentially your own existence in relation to that world when you feel pain.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you very much. I'm wondering whether you think there are only two senses of good or good for, and then I guess either way, whether yes or no, is there something that shows that there isn't some other sense of good or good for connected to reasons or connected to I don't know what, on which it would be more immediately intelligible? For example, whether it's better to preserve a human life than an animal life or so on. Is there some kind of exhaustiveness in the two senses that you have in mind?
Do you have another sense in mind? It's a little hard for me just
Yeah.
to, just to come up here and offer me the opportunity to think of a counterexample to my own view.
Sure, okay. So I guess I don't have something very sharp in mind, but vaguely some kind of buck passing notion where good means something like worthy of choice or something we have reason to want or pursue. I guess even if that is a distinct sense of good, it might turn out that those things are still all tied to our functions, but at least it would be less obvious.
And I am, by the way, going to say something about buck passing tomorrow as
Okay,
well.
yeah.
But do you think there's any reason to believe that the practical results would turn out any different?
It's at least much harder for me to tell. I mean, if it turns out that, for example, there's something about human choice that gives us reason to preserve all rational beings that doesn't then apply in animal cases, that might be a practically different result. So I guess I'm inclined to think there might be.
Yeah, I guess I never know what's supposed to follow from a buck passing view until I know how I'm supposed to know which considerations are reasons
Right.
and which ones are not. And without a theory of that, it's a little hard to say what might be the case.
Okay, so but you're not committed to the view that there are only two senses of good?
I don't have an argument that it's exhaustive.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for your lecture, which is groundbreaking for someone who's worked so deeply with Kantian perspectives. Without minimizing that, I wanted to ask two questions. One, first of all, about the ecological role of decision-making. First of all, we have this tethered notion of value, which I took to be, you said something about objective value still being possible as sort of a intersubjectivity. And I was wondering, I wanted to hear more about sort of like a Uexkühlian way of how we access the tethered value of non-humans and incorporate it into our dialogues. So that would be one question. The second had to do with why stop at animals? Sure, this is obviously groundbreaking work to include animals in this Aristotelian Kantian structure. Nonetheless, recent work on plant biology has shown that plants distinguish between self and other, same species and other species, that Susan Simard's work on the dissemination of nutrients in forests from trees, who are the mother trees, to other parts of the vegetal ecosystem. So, yeah, thank you.
Right. Okay. As far as your first question is concerned, I don't have anything very interesting to say about it, since partly, as I said in response to one of the earlier questions, I don't have the morality of all this worked out yet. The way we know what's good for the other animals is simply by knowing as much as we can about how they function. Which is not always easy to do there. But as far as plants are concerned, I've gone back and forth on this issue and held every possible position, from the idea that only animals have a good, through the idea that both plants and animals have a good, all the way down to, in one frenzied footnote, the idea that all substances have a good. We should just treat everything in a way that's appropriate to its nature. I think that it is important to the argument I was making today that the good get firmly tied to the notion of having some kind of a self. I think that's the only way you can overcome a certain kind of objection coming from the biological end of things. The kinds of studies you're talking about would tend to show that plants perhaps are very minimal kinds of agents with very minimal kinds of selves. And then I would be required to count them as among the things that have a good. I think the jury's still out on whether those things are true or not. But I mean, obviously, plants are agents Maybe not in the sense of being guided by representations, but certainly in the sense of being self-movers. They respond to cues in their environment by growing deeper roots or turning towards the sun. So they're already different from mere things in the sense that they're self-starting, and the things they self-start for are the things that tend to be for their functional good. So it is consistent with this picture to treat them sort of as very minimal agents.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I had a couple questions about the way that you were thinking about the relationship between organisms and selves, and in particular about this notion of identifying with a self. At first it occurs to me that, it's selves that are doing the identification and not organisms, and you can have organisms that aren't capable of doing that, right? So it's in virtue, I would think, of having or being a self that, any of this is possible. And so I was wondering, how is it that you're thinking of a self, and your gloss on this elsewhere was a point of view, such that it could be identified with an organism, right? And what identifying with would be? Is that, a judgment of the form, this is that,
Well, obviously not, because I'm taking this a long way down the animal scale.
Sure.
I take it that the relation between an organism and a self is that an organism has a self when the organism functions in a way that generates a point of view for it. So however that works biologically, that's the relation. And that's a relation that I'm saying in my loose way is true of animals and not of plants, although that isn't exactly true according to current scientific accounts of what animals and plants are. So it looks, for instance, as if, on current ways of understanding these things, a sponge is an animal, not a plant, but it's not clear that a sponge has a self in my sense. So I'm kind of using Aristotelian definitions here rather than up-to-date scientific ones. But as far as identifying with the self, obviously it's only in the case of human beings that you're sort of explicitly thinking about which parts of you are you, and although human beings get notoriously confused when they try to think about that philosophically. But the sense of something as happening to me or threatening me or something like that, those are all ways that reflect the way you identify yourself. So it's sort of what you identify with as you and what you identify as the world in your interactions with the world and in your fears and hopes and delights and stuff, sort of what's a good thing happening to me and what's a bad thing happening to me. That's yourself.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I had two questions. The first question was whether there isn't a way, on your view, to understand the idea that animals generally might be less important. And I was thinking it would go something like this. It would be, you'd argue that animals in general have less unified selves than we do. And then, unless there's something special about death or pain, as far as like bad things that could happen to animals go, maybe everything is less important to all other animals than those things would be to us, because all other animals have less unified selves. So I was curious, would that be a way of having a view on which all the other animals are less important that would be consistent, if you could make that argument that animals generally are less unified than us?
Well, if everything that's important has to be important to someone, I don't see how you can make the argument that some animals are less important than others unless they're less important to everyone. But it's not clear to me how you would make that argument.
It would be sort of it would be recognizable as the old view in the sense that we'd just always take less seriously the needs and concerns of animals because the animals would always be less concerned themselves about their own needs than human beings are.
Well, the trouble with that is, the trouble with using the old view is it's just wrong. If you looked at what is important to animals themselves, it does not justify treating animals sort of less well, sort of across the board. And in particular, does not justify imposing terrible suffering on them for the sake of mere human pleasures.
I guess maybe another way to put my question is there something special about death and pain? Or is it the case that all of the ends an animal has, if it's a less unified being than us, are less important to that animal as a result of being less unified? And maybe I won't ask my other question because it seems like you can't.
I don't actually see any sort of general conclusion of that sort. At least I wouldn't be prepared without looking at specific goods to say. I wouldn't say everything is less important to animals. I mentioned cases in which pains, for instance, might be worse for animals because they can't laugh at them and don't know they're about to be over. So there are things that are more important in the sense of better or worse for animals because of their simplicity rather than less.
Thanks.
Thank you. I agree 100% that it's a nonsensical question, and I would just like to add some more ammunition. Is the heart more valuable than the liver? As though we have a choice. Also, someone said that the best way to judge a society is how well it treats the least powerful of its members. So
Gandhi.
even if humans are important, we have to take care of the other species. It's our duty. And third, last, try to show me a human. There are more non-human cells in the human body than there are human cells. So show me the human. I mean, it's impossible. Can't be separated.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask something similar to what's been asked before. So ask about bacteria, right? So these are things that maintain their own form by doing something that looks a whole lot like they have a point of view on the world, right? They're able to, their locomotion is guided by sort of informational states that are able to distinguish between foods like sucrose, between poisons like leucine, right? And I agree with the idea that, so what's got to be different between them and animals, they don't represent the goods, the things to be avoided, the things to be pursued, right? They don't experience them as things to be avoided or pursued. And I sort of agree that that's probably where the sort of moral distinction, or where the value distinction lies between animals that have value and things that don't. But I'm not sure why, right? Why shouldn't we say that no, bacteria do have point of views because they have these informational states, because they're able to, selectively pursue foods and avoid poisons? I'm not sure why, with so much of what is there in a point of view, why this sort of experience and representations are what seems to be the difference maker here.
Right. It's very hard for me to talk about what the difference maker is without getting my story about valence onto the table and why it matters. Because in a way, what you're saying is, why did it matter so much that the experiences that guide an animal should be valenced, rather than just sort of stimulus response or like machines?
It's why does it matter that it's like almost the opposite. It's why does it matter that the sort of valenced behavior should be experienced, right? Is almost the question.
Right. It's still true that without the story about valence, yeah. So.
Well, that was an absolutely wonderful, rich and provocative talk, so thank you very much.
Thank you.